Traditionally, one waits until reality becomes history before one rewrites the history. In the case of President Bush, however, as he embarks upon his legacy-building efforts, we have a presidency that boasted of actually creating reality as it went along. And thus, in our fourth story, at a speech tonight about his legacy in the Middle East, Mr. Bush rewrote history to match the reality in his mind, if any. Among the highlights, U.S. failure in Iraq would have unleashed chaos, widened violence, and given safe havens to terrorists. All of which, of course, happened anyway, thanks to our invasion of Iraq. Mr. Bush has also decided that the Iraq war got Muammar Gaddafi to end his nuclear program in Libya. In fact, that was well in the works before and pushed largely by European diplomacy. He claims the war marginalized Iran rather than, of course, what really happened, removed its biggest check and gave it a new friend. And the war also got Iran to end its nuclear program, a development that did not prevent Mr. Bush, in the same speech, from warning of the nuclear threat from Iran. And al-Qaeda, Mr. Bush says, has failed to take over any nations, as if unashamed that there is still an al-Qaeda. And just one paragraph after Mr. Bush referred to the Hamas victory in Palestine. He claimed the Iraq war was made necessary by 9/11, after which, quote, we realized that we are in a struggle with fanatics pledged to our destruction, something history will probably note he was supposed to realize after the first World Trade Center bombing, the embassy bombings, the USS Cole attack, al-Qaeda's open declaration of war, and the August 7th President's daily briefing. But on the same day Mr. Bush first used that word recession to describe the economy's status for the last year, it will be his flirtations with fallibility that fuel the headlines.
As with any large undertaking, these efforts have not always gone according to plan. And in some areas, we've fallen short of our hopes. For example, the fight in Iraq has been longer and more costly than expected.
Not longer and more costly than I expected, than I told you, and tragically remote from a simple, got it wrong. With us tonight, Chris Hayes, Washington editor of The Nation magazine. Good evening, Chris.
Hey there, Keith.
Mr. Bush has made this bizarre argument before that 9/11 changed everything, and you maybe just sort of concede to him that for lay people, most lay people, okay, sure, they were not expected to know that 9/11s were conceivable, but isn't he essentially admitting that he failed before 9/11 to recognize the threat despite numerous attacks and more numerous warnings?
Yeah, although I think in the hierarchy of sins of George W. Bush, I mean, that might be pretty low in terms of the whitewashing he's doing. I mean, the fact of the matter is, whoever was going to be president during 9/11, if 9/11 had happened, and we don't know how preventable it was ultimately, you know, that was going to create some sort of reorientation in the nation's foreign policy. What the real disaster was what they chose to do with that. And what's so sort of bizarre and offensive in certain respects is that he continues to believe that the path that was taken in response to that was somehow the right path when it's become so obvious that it wasn't.
The rate of women being killed in Basra right now for the so-called honor offense against their family has risen 70% in the last year. And as we know, Mr. Bush sacrificed 4,200 Americans to swap a contained dictator for this fractured democratic theocracy that's friendly to Iran. And we're supposed to say, yeah, okay, those were reasons to go through all this the last 7 years?
Yeah, and we should also add that the amount of civilian casualties in Iraq since the war started is anywhere between 150,000 and to as many as over 1 million. It's very difficult to get the right number, but the lower bound is around 150,000. A tremendous, tremendous mass of human suffering and death that has come in the wake of our actions there. And I still think that not only the Bush administration, but in some respects, the entire country still hasn't quite looked that in the face. I mean, what exactly the legacy of what we have done there is. And, you know, we're not going to get that kind of reconciliation or that kind of catharsis from Bush, it's clear. But we're going to have to do something as a culture, I think, and as a polity going forward to really wrestle with what happened there.
And as Mr. Bush tries to wrestle with the historians, and he says, look how I cleaned up the Middle East, which was the gist of this text today. Right. I mean, based on how it flies with you know, people who have both eyes, both ears working now, is that a good guess of how it's going to fly with historians?
No, I mean, look, we have achieved tremendous consensus on the Bush administration. I mean, it's really remarkable to track it when only, you know, crazy lefties were saying these things early on, and certain people on television such as yourself, that this was really a disastrous and failed presidency. I mean, that's consensus now. I mean, it's very difficult to find anyone, I think, in the country. There, you know, his approval ratings are somewhere around 22%. But historians, commentators, I mean, the war that's going to be be engaged now is why it failed. But the fact that it failed, that it was a disaster, I think is beyond dispute at this point.
And lastly, my point about saying that he's always said that 9/11 had nothing to do with Saddam Hussein. Did they lock Cheney away or stuff cotton in his ears before they made that speech today?
You know, the weirdest thing about that is that it seems antique in a way. I mean, it really seems like, you know, that he hasn't been, that they've sort of taken him out of suspended animation to give these speeches, and things are happening so quickly in the world. There's such a vacuum of leadership in Washington. It almost seems like we go into these time machines every time he pops up to go back and throw out the same old justifications for the war. You know, you almost want to be, you know, you really want to turn the page, and I think the country really feels like that can't happen fast enough right now.
Yeah, the president was just notified this morning that the Boston Red Sox won the World Series and ended their streak in 2004. Chris Hayes of The Nation, as always, many thanks. Have a good weekend, Chris.
You have a good weekend, too.